John G. Searle Professor of Economics and Management at the Yale School of Management. His research focuses on creative development, the paths of development creators follow. He is the author of The Nature of Creative Development, Stanford University Press, 2006. His current research focuses on building formal models of creative development in rich fields/environments. A key step is using knowledge representation to model the environment. The models highlight the rich and unique patterns of learning and paths of development of individuals, as well as how individuals build on the work of each other in the development of fields. Professor Feinstein earned his BA degree at Stanford University and his PhD in economics from MIT. He taught at the Stanford Graduate School of Business before coming to Yale. Beyond his work on creativity, he has made a series of contributions in the fields of economics, including detection-controlled models that have been extensively applied in tax administration and the analysis of regulatory systems, and contributions in the area of tax compliance and auditing, counterterrorism, and socioeconomic status and health. Today's presentation is titled Creativity and Complexity, and I'd like you to welcome Professor Feinstein. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. It's a real privilege to be here, and it's been really nice to meet so many of you over the past few days. I love the diversity of this conference all around the world and all the different fields that are represented. So it's an honor for me to come up and talk to you for a few minutes about what I do. I changed the name of this talk to Creative Development. First of all, that's what I study. And second of all, as I went through the conference, I felt that was maybe a better reflection of what I was gaining and kind of some of the interactions I had at the conference, so you'll pardon me that. I'm going to go in 3 steps. I'm going to just talk to you a bit about why I do what I do. Then I'm going to give you 2 examples of creative development to give you a sense for how I think about it. And then I'll come back around at the end of the talk and show you some of the building blocks that I use to put some of these models together. It's going to go kind of fast. I got a lot of slides. I don't have that much time, so stay with me. How does creativity come about? It's an important question that we think about from a lot of different field domains. It can occur in a moment, and I think everyone's had those moments, but the popular conception really just focuses there, the moment when creativity happens, and I think the real story, or at least a very important piece of the story, is how we set those moments up. So what are all the things that people are doing so that they can actually come to a moment when creativity would happen? I think about that as creative development. I think of it as an unfolding process that could really take quite a long time. It depends on the person. So we got this image of the light bulb. I saw at least twice in this conference in the preceding days where people put up a light bulb as a reference to creativity. I'm not criticizing them at all, but it is a symbol we use for creativity, and it's a slight misconception, I think, because it just focuses on that moment. So it'd be great to move to some other symbols. I had a Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon, but I took that out just to avoid distracting you. We could do this to the light bulb, or we could just eliminate the light bulb entirely and realize that it's probably a more complex process than that as far as how it actually happens. What's a link to this conference? And I've heard so many interesting talks from different people. I kind of worked down in the nitty-gritty. How does an individual person or maybe a team actually create a new idea or something new? And I think of that as creative development. One way I would think about that as far as application is education. How can we support individuals in this process? We've had some great people talking at this conference who I really admire and respect them because they are on the grounds helping other people learn how to do things and how to be creative. I tend to be a little more on the theory building side right now because when you look at our educational system out there in the world, including the United States, which I would recognize as a very sort of creatively entrepreneurial type of a place, along with many other parts of the world, you'd still find that we don't really support creativity and creative development the way we probably should be doing it in secondary school, probably in college. So it's nice to think about how we could do a little better job with that. In terms of where I've come from all this, I kind of put up these 2 things on these different sides, and one reason why I'm here. I'm trained in economics and the social sciences. Those models are very simplified. You'd have to say they're oversimplified for some applications. They're designed to explain human behavior, and they're designed to predict what you're going to do. They're designed to predict what you're going to have for breakfast, how much money you're going to save this year, whether or not you're going to go to college, lots and lots of other dimensions. There's a little bit of an illusion, I think, that we're predicting with these models because the models in their simplified form do make predictions. And when we go out and do statistics with the models, we get some degree of agreement. But it's a little bit tenuous, I think, oftentimes, and I think the models get sort of trapped in their own simplicity. I teach those models. I respect the models for what they do. On the other side, you have sort of worlds of complexity. The environment is very complex, and there's whole fields out there of knowledge representation. We just saw a piece of it referred to in the talk that just happened, as well as several other talks. John Coffey's talk at this conference, for example, on concept maps. Trying to represent knowledge, there's millions and millions of things out there. And the question is, how do we bring those together? That's kind of where I see myself. I'm really using the stuff on the right side as a helper to me. I'm not trying to build new theory exactly of knowledge representation. I'm trying to use that and see how we integrate that with what is powerful on the left-hand side, which is very decision analysis guided modeling so we understand what people are doing. Where it kind of comes together for me is using the right side for the environment and using the left side to think about learning and eventually choices about projects and creativity generation. So what's going on during these long periods of creative development? There's a lot of learning, rich, complex patterns. There's a lot of experimentation. Eventually, creative contributions emerge out of that process. Let me give you two examples. Here's an example of an artist. One will be an artist and one will be a technology person. Piet Mondrian. By the way, it doesn't matter if you don't like his art. If you do or you don't, it really doesn't matter to me. What I'm interested in is the process he went through. That's it, okay? Luckily, in the case of Piet Mondrian, we know quite a bit about his process. I'm going to just trace for you real quickly the critical period of his development where he broke through to what he at least thought of as a modern art form around 1921. His art was actually rooted in philosophy. He was very involved with what was called theosophy in the Netherlands at that time. And really what you see in his work is this interplay between principles or concepts and the development of the art in a much more concrete way. And again, the talk we just had is very connected with that, I would say, because you have different levels of concepts that you're putting together here. I don't think that's unusual at all. I think many, many creative people I study, they're working on these different levels and they're thinking about how to put them together. What is interesting with him is that we're going to be able to see something about that conceptual level. This is kind of where he started in 1908. It's a picture of a red tree, a painting. It's beautiful, but it's fairly naturalistic. You can already see a lot of articulation of branches in that painting, but still it's a representation of a tree. Here's one he did just a bit later. It's Amaryllis. It's got a little more sharply defined vertical shaft there to that flower, and then the flower comes out of it on top. But again, it's a naturalistic painting of a flower. Phase one of his development went roughly right after that till about 1915. What's interesting about Mondrian is that he kept notebooks where he wrote down a lot of his ideas as he was going along. And I've had the chance to go through all those notebooks. So we really see his thinking process at the same time at which we see him doing the art. That is so valuable to me if I'm looking at how somebody's creating something. And I don't think it's unusual. I think you can go find that. You have to go out there and really look for it. So he thought about it in terms of spirit and matter. Here's what he wrote. As consciousness evolves, the two converge. Spirit and matter become a unity. That was his conception. You don't have to agree with it, or it doesn't really matter. It's just what he was thinking about. And he said abstract or primary forms are employed. Then he took another step, and he said, here's the principles I'm going to use. Woman is going to be the matter element. Man is going to be the spirit element. The matter element's represented by the horizontal line, and the spirit element by the vertical line. Here's something he wrote about that. Since the male principle is the vertical line, a man shall recognize this element in the ascending trees of a forest. He sees his complement in the horizontal line of the sea. The woman with the horizontal line as characteristic element recognizes herself in the recumbent lines of the sea. He's kind of a poet as well, and he's thinking about this is the conception. What's really interesting right here is how he goes from the conception to some pretty concrete principles for how he's going to think about it in the world of art. So he steps back, and this is one of the first paintings he did after that. It's called The Great Tree. Something that's interesting about Mondrian at this time is that he actually started to paint in black and white. And I think that the reason he did that was to simplify his problem, because he was trying to figure out how to represent that conception in painting, and it was pretty hard for him, so he thought, I'll just work with black and white first to see what I can do. So he went back to a tree. He's articulating it a little bit more abstractly if you look at that. This is a painting he did a few years later, pretty well-known painting called Composition 10 in black and white. Really articulates the horizontal and vertical lines, and notice how they're sort of fitting together. The only thing that isn't got the straight lines in it is just the overall circular framing of the painting. Then he went on to phase 2 of his development. In 1917, he completed an important essay, The New Plastic in Painting, probably the most important essay that he wrote in his life as far as about his painting work. He added colors and started thinking about how am I going to represent or include colors in this coherent sort of philosophy I'm trying to represent. He emphasized that they were going to be simple primary colors in order to sort of approach the ideal as close as he could. He wasn't interested in subtleties of colors. He was interested in colors just as ways to reflect this unity that he was trying to get at. So he focused on rectangular color planes, and I think probably the key phrase in a lot of what he writes in that essay is what he calls equilibrated relationships among colors. So how is he going to put them together in a way that's going to reflect that harmony of spirit and matter, which he thinks of as how human consciousness is actually evolving. And he also emphasizes that it's going to be an abstract art to show the universal, not a particular scene. So he really flipped from where he started, where I showed you at the beginning of this. His puzzle at that time was, how do I realize that in art? Here's the composition he did just after that. It's in 1916. It's in the Guggenheim Museum in New York. To be honest with you, I think that Mondrian kind of thought of this as a failure. Even though that painting is worth many, many millions of dollars today. But leaving that aside, he thought of it as a failure because he was trying to see how he could put together the horizontal and vertical elements with the rectangular colors, and he really couldn't find a way to do it that he felt was harmonious. So this is a period of a lot of experimentation for Mondrian. This is something he did in 1917. You notice it's gotten simpler. So much of creativity is about simplifying, actually taking stuff out of what you're doing. That's a really key step. I often tell my students about that. They often forget that that's actually a lot of what it's about. So he's simplifying, but I think he still wasn't too happy. The things are kind of jumbled a little bit. He went even simpler later that year in the composition with color planes 2, just has the rectangular color planes, trying to think about how they relate to each other. Took a really important step, I think, in 1919 with this painting, which is called the checkerboard composition. He put a very uniform grid on the painting and then filled in each box there with a given color. So he's trying to think about how to get the colors to relate to each other in a very structured way. You could see why he would do that, right? It's kind of helping him create some structure. Finally, 1920, this is called Composition A. That is probably the first painting I've shown you that you would identify immediately as a Mondrian painting. He went back from the checkerboard composition, went back up to larger rectangles of somewhat different sizes, brought back in the horizontal and vertical black lines in a way that he thought of as harmonious. I'll just show you one other one here in this period. This is one I particularly like. It's hanging in Dallas. Really captures, I think, what he was trying to do. Mondrian actually wrote in a letter at this time, I feel like I've been able to capture some of my conception. I'm going to go further. I'm always going to go further, but I feel at least that I've made some progress towards where I started. He did keep going. This is an example of a painting he did towards the very end of his life. He had moved to New York City. It's called the Broadway Boogie Woogie. I think he was kind of inspired by the taxi cabs in New York City. He said on a winter, on an evening when it's raining, he was very impressed by the yellow that was sort of shining through the city. That's Piet Mondrian, just real quick. Let's do somebody else real quick, Jack Dorsey and Twitter. I'll do this a little bit faster. Actually, that is Jack Dorsey also keeps notebooks, and that's an example. I think that's one of the pages on which he wrote some of the earliest ideas for what became Twitter. But here's what LA Times article, a very good article, said about him. Twitter didn't just fly out of thin air and land on a branch, which you might think, because it seems so simple. As Dorsey explains, it has conceptual roots in the world of vehicle dispatch, where cars and bikes zooming around town must constantly squawk to each other about where they are and what they're up to. You would probably not have realized that. Unless you know about his creative development, you wouldn't realize that that was actually the origins of Twitter. He grew up in St. Louis, and he was really fascinated with the city life there, and he was particularly fascinated with all the people moving around the city, the bicycle messengers, the dispatchers, emergency vehicles, taxis, and how they were constantly sending information back to central hubs about where they are and what the conditions were where they were. Like if there's a traffic jam or an accident somewhere, they would send back to the dispatcher, this is what's happening here. That was actually where he started. He became a programmer, and he was a very good programmer from a young age. I don't think he had really fused those things together, though, originally. Around 2000, just going to the bottom bullet point, he was working in the computer world. Instant messaging came out. His first attempt was to say, hey, I'd love people to be able to sit down at the computer and write a short message to their friends about what they're doing right now. It turned out not to work. It was really a failure. Again, that's one of the themes of creative development is there's plenty of failures along the way, and you got to sort of keep yourself going. It just wasn't mobile enough. By the time you got back to your computer, you wrote the message, it was kind of too late. So that didn't work out, but he was learning from that. A couple years later, he was working in San Francisco at a company called Odeo. The company was actually failing. So again, creativity, the moments can be opportunistic. They're embedded in a much richer story, but the moment when something happens is sometimes an opportunistic moment when the cards are set up or aligned correctly. Because they were failing, they put employees in groups to brainstorm. He actually brought up this idea of maybe we could build a mobile system to send bursts of messages to friends about how you are. The group loved it, and within, I think, a few weeks, they had a prototype going, and that's how Twitter was born, actually. But that was actually about 10 years after he started on that journey back in St. Louis. All right, so that's two people real quick. Creative development, sorry, I can't pause to take any breaths here. We'll have some questions at the end, because I'd love to get through all these slides. Process of development of individuals engaged in a creative endeavor. That's how I think about it, through which people come to be creative and make contributions. I'll be honest with you, I'm a lot less hung up on the contributions and a lot more interested in the process. When I teach my creativity class at Yale, one of the places I start is creativity is a process. And until you understand that, you're not going to do it well, you're not going to manage it well, there's going to be a lot of obstacles to you. And it's a winding path a lot of the time. You could ask any entrepreneur about that. Every thought you have, every experience, in fact, everything's encoded in your knowledge structure. And again, the first talk this morning is from someone who's probably much more expert about what's going on inside the brain than I am. I tend to look sort of outside in a way. But that knowledge structure is evolving, and it's really where the sources of creativity. But for me, I'm trying to put that together with the environment. So I'm going to circle back to where I started this talk and tell you a little bit about some of the building blocks to what I do. Creative development occurs within a rich environment in our world. I think that's kind of necessary for the kinds of learning sets or conceptual structures that people build up, which generate the kind of creativity that we're kind of familiar with. It doesn't mean that other organisms or entities can't be creative through other processes, but in the human world, this is where it's happening. Knowledge representation, I think, is really important because it's a way to model the complexity that's out there, at least to some degree, for anything that's organized around knowledge. And I think of that very broadly. I'll come back to that at the end. Something like social interaction, that's still a part of the knowledge representation, ultimately, if you want to be careful about it. So you got to put all that in there. That's a pretty daunting task. I'm never going to achieve that task. I'm aware of that after some years. What I'm trying to do is build models that point to that process or depict it in a way where we can understand some principles of how people would go about engaging in creative development in that kind of an environment. That's what I see as the purpose here. I'm really interested in modeling the learning process. So I really go back to my decision analysis and economics roots where we have very good ways of thinking about learning. And what I'm interested in is how people are building up learning sets as they go through these paths of development in these fairly complex environments. What are the patterns? What do the paths look like? What are some empirics or predictions we could make about them? And again, how could we bring that back to education and help people understand something about what that's going to look like? I have to admit, for me, I also have a little bit of an idealist sense. It's really linked to me to the idea of individualism in a free society, which of course economics is about. But the weird thing is that the economics models aren't at all about that. So I feel a little nervous that we have this huge field going around with these very simple models that has really lost touch with what is the grounding principle, which is a huge amount of respect for individuals or teams or groups or communities to actually create things. So one of my goals is build some models that help get that back at the table that we can understand better how that's happening. So we could balance the scales a little bit with a lot of modeling on the other side that is very simple about people, and I think sometimes leads us to some false ideas about how we're going to control their behavior or sort of set things up in society. Here's some of the steps that I think about creative development having. People have creative interests or intuitions. Actually, in the work that I do, I think about these in an economic sense as intuitive signals that they get, which is ideas about what might be fruitful or what they're intrinsically interested in exploring. That is very important to this process because in a complex world, you've got to go through a guided exploration process or you're not going to really get to where you want to get to. So I spent a lot of time thinking about how do we define those. If you go back to Mondrian and the idea, for example, of the horizontal female element and the male vertical and how that ties into painting, that's a great example of a guiding principle or a conception that would guide him in his artistic work. That's already a fairly complicated conceptual statement, right? I mean, you have to think about that as a conceptual statement in the world of knowledge representation with a number of concepts and how they're interrelated. At the most precise level, that's how you'd want to think about it. And that's just one conception of many that he would have thought about as he was going through his life. Sometimes those conceptions are really narrow. I didn't talk about some other people. Albert Einstein's a great, wonderful person that I talked about in the class who started from a paradox, as you may know, at the age of 16 that was actually really precise and pretty specific. But he really expanded out from there to a much broader set of creative interests, and that was how he reached over actually to philosophy, which is where he really made the key link to come up with the special theory of relativity. I think questions are really important. All that's so important. You know, I love to talk about von Humboldt. Von Humboldt had a huge impact on Charles Darwin in the sense that Darwin wanted to go to South America partly because of what von Humboldt had written in his personal narrative. And Darwin kept incredibly rich notebooks, by the way, so we can go back and learn a lot about his process as an example of a scientist. Those are rich patterns. It's unique. One of the things I find so fascinating, I could sit here and look at all of you. I already know from talking to a lot of you that you're unique people. But you know, every person's got a unique conceptual structure in their head. Every person has seen this talk and a different train of thought is going through their head. You might be thinking about something different. Maybe you're just daydreaming, and that's okay. But maybe you're making some interconnections between this and something else, right? That's how it works. Also, it's a recursive process, so you got to think about modeling it a little bit that way. We learn, we have ideas, we do projects. That generates new interests, new intuitions about what to do, and you have to model that process somewhere down the road if you want to see where somebody's going to get to. Let me just go to the end of this talk and talk a bit about idea generation. So that's another important piece, obviously. Coming back to the light bulb metaphor, I don't like the metaphor, but I recognize that there are moments when we have those ideas. This is actually one of the places I also start in my class, the definition of creativity, connecting or relating two elements that have not previously been connected or related. Okay, that's actually a pretty widely accepted definition of creativity out there in the field. In the psychology literature, you'd think about that a little bit as spreading activation in the brain that lights up some different networks and eventually allows some connections to get made, and there's some really interesting recent work on that. Actually, Mednick, the psychologist who originally talked about this, called it remote associates in the brain. I'm really more interested in out in the world, how people learn stuff and then connect it. That's kind of where I go as more of an economist or social scientist. You know, that definition is broader than it might appear to you. For example, if you connect a solution to a problem, so you have a novel solution to a problem, you are connecting two things together. So right there, that fits this definition. If you make an application of a theory or a framework in a new area, that's a creative connection. Mondrian was linking compositional elements, first the male and the female, and later the color planes, rectangular planes with the vertical and horizontal lines. Those are creative connections. So I think once you get used to thinking of it this way, you find out that a lot of things fit with the definition. In the work that I've done looking at this, there's really two primary pathways through which ideas get generated off of that framework. One is what I call creative responses, and that is you've got this conceptual structure, you encounter a stimulus or an experience, and in that zone of intersection between what you already know and are thinking about and what you've encountered, there's a lot of creativity right there. And so you might see something, everyone might look at that slide, but you might see something about that slide because of something that you know that is a unique connection that nobody else in this room is actually making. I could give you so many examples of creativity out there in the world that have happened where this is how it happened. And that does tend to happen very fast oftentimes. It could happen immediately. It could happen within a day or a few weeks because it's a very direct stimulus response. Number two, the sort of logical partner to that is you've built all these structures up, and eventually you make some links between elements in your own conceptual structure that have not previously been connected. And again, Einstein would be a great example of that, where he had some physics ideas. He reached over to philosophy. You could argue about which philosophy, but in my opinion, David Hume was the key author that he read. And eventually, in reading that book, about 6 months or 8 months later, he took something that Hume had said about time, and he connected it over to the physics in a very specific way to solve his problem. So he had the ideas in his head, and eventually he made this connection, a pretty remote association in a lot of ways. Not that other people weren't aware of some of those interrelations, but he did it a lot more precisely. Finally, the third phase of creative development I would call the project phase. Everyone's engaging in projects, you formulate them. It tends to be a more inwardly focused phase, but there's a lot of creativity in projects as well. Through revisioning. One of the things I talk about in my class on this is Picasso's painting La Demoiselle d'Avignon. It's a wonderful painting. You can see it in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. But we know now, although we didn't know when Picasso was alive, but after he died, we discovered these boxes of these preparatory materials he had done to make this painting. And I spent about 20 or 30 minutes in my class showing students the book. Probably, I think I counted something like 2,000 images that he had done as he was working to develop the final painting. And if you look at the final painting, it looks so simple again, you would never have imagined that. And he didn't really want to reveal that, actually. But that turns out to be the case. And that was really revisioning, once he already had some conception of the project, a lot of work inside the project. And a lot of the most important ideas for that painting actually came at the very end of his work on the painting. So I gave you three kind of phases: creative interests and intuitions, which is exploration, idea generation, and project work. And I like to think of it as those phases and a lot of cycling through the phases. We shouldn't forget the social environment, which is an important part as well. Collaboration, by the way, in terms of the idea of a creative response, another great illustration is two people have a conversation. They each have creative interests and conceptual structures, and the zone of intersection between them is such a powerful place for creativity. I think we all have had that experience. I love Patti Smith's music, for one thing, but also this book she wrote called Just Kids is a great book, I think, of the world. I read tons of biographies and memoirs and all of that. I've been doing that since I was probably 6 years old. It's probably the roots for me of what I'm doing now in a lot of ways. And a lot of those memoirs from the point of view of rock music are pretty bad, I have to say, in my opinion. This one is a great one. I'd recommend it. What I found really interesting about the book was that I went through the book. Every single page, she's talking about someone she met, a conversation she had, some person entering into her creative process. And through the book as a whole, there are hundreds of people she's interacting with. So it's a very social interaction perspective. That's her and Robert Mapplethorpe actually next to her. It's a book about both of them. And it's really a very social interactionist, if I want to use that term, perspective on it. Do you want me to wrap up?
5 minutes.
Oh, that's all I need, 5 minutes, that's perfect. I'm just going to do one more thing, and actually in about 2 minutes, and just tell you about one paper I'm just working on right now to sort of wrap up a little bit of what I'm doing. This is called The Creative Development of Fields, Model How a Field Develops Through the Sequence of Contributions Individuals Make. That's the paper. It's actually got a revision I'm about to send back into the Journal of the Knowledge Economy, so we'll see how that goes. But they seem to be interested in it. What I did in this paper was I started a field at an initial state, which is on the top left, and I said, okay, one person after another is going to enter the field. So it's very simple. I've streamlined it down to just a sequence of people. And you enter the field, you see what's been done, you may get some intuitions about new connections that might be valuable, and then you choose something to try to make. This field, by the way, is a little bit like a lattice, and I didn't talk about that here, but knowledge representation, one of the powerful approaches is to think about knowledge as a lattice structure, if you're familiar with a lattice. I think it's a very useful way to think about it. It's beautiful from the point of view of this idea of creative connections, because a lattice, every element is created by connecting two elements together, correct? So it really is a logical connection with the world of creativity. This shows you through 5 generations. Generation 1, the person ended up making a larger element with a smaller one. Generation 2 on the far right on the top, nothing got made because the person tried something that didn't work. Generation 3 on the bottom left, a new element got made, which is a little bit in from the left towards the bottom. Generation 4, A lower element got made even further down as the lattice starts to extend. And generation 5, that element was, the elements from the previous 2 generations are actually used to produce the element at the very bottom of that triangle at the bottom of the figure. So that's one of the things you learn as you do these simulations is how much does somebody build on what was just done and how much do they build on some earlier stuff that was already in the field. That'd be one example. Now what I did actually with that model was I looked at, from an initial state, every possible path of development of the field given some parameterization of the system. And actually this just shows you as an example from that initial state I showed you, given the way the system was set up, there were 7 potential paths going forward, and then each of those opened up into more paths. There were anywhere from a few hundred to a few thousand paths generated through 5 or 6 generations. One of the things that's interesting, if you look at the probabilities, I'm a probability tree person. My initial course when I walked into Stanford was teaching decision trees, and which I didn't understand at all at the time, I have to tell you. And I made some mistakes the first year, which the students were very kind and forgave me. But it turned out to be super important for me because a lot of decision analysis is about probabilities and updating, and I really mastered that over the years of teaching it. Because if you teach it, you learn it. I think most of us would agree. One thing that's interesting about the probabilities is that some paths are pretty likely, and there are paths out there that are very, very rare. So you might look at this field and the paths that are possible. Some of those paths only occur with probability 1 in a million. So one of the interesting things you get out of the model is some calibration in a field if you can write down the knowledge structure of what's the distribution of paths. And there are some paths that are unusual because somebody got an intuition that led them to go in a direction that other people without that intuition would not go. So we can calibrate that, and one of the things that comes out of the model is a lot of path dependence, which is that as people build something, that does open up for later people to come in and build something else. So this just shows you as an example some of the structures that were created in that model. I guess it's a bit of modern art itself in a way. And I'll just stop right there. We're really just at the beginning, I think, of modeling creativity, the way it happens out in the world as a pretty rich, complex process. It's naturally system related. It's got decision theory, psych theory, social science. There's a lot out there to do, I think. It's an exciting place to work. Thank you very much.